everyone, this is Fresher from Lab 1 and we're proud to bring to the Reason Rack our latest rack extension called Enforcer. Enforcer is a dynamic saturator, which basically means there is an envelope system that controls the level of the saturation going through the device. This works similar sort of way to an expander or a compressor with the envelope, but instead of squeezing or stretching the audio down and up, we're basically using an envelope to control how the saturation signal is fed basically to your output. This can add character and tone, but not so much just a full on or off, or you have to go and automate everything. It's done so it can be a bit more of a set and a forget, but have fun with saturation as well. And it can bring out some really great sounds out of static loops that you may not even heard the slight sounds within, and we'll go through a few demos just to express that as well. Enforcer is split into three sections. You have an input and saturation section, you have the envelope section, and you have a post EQ section. There are two controls that set the level of the input and the output of Enforcer. These are plus minus 18 dB, so you have quite a good range of control before you go into the saturation, or if you want to crank it, and you can also tame it back by bringing the level down as well. Onto the filter section before we get onto the saturation. The filter section is optional to use it, so you could choose to filter a signal before it gets to the saturation section, or you can filter the dry signal, so you basically, it's like a crossover of a speaker and that sort of effect, so you can basically mix and match with your filtering. You can choose to use it or you don't have to. It's the option is there, and that's why we put it in this way. You have a crossover frequency, which basically where you have the crossover of two filters, especially a low pass and a high pass, the frequency of this crossover is the same. So no matter where you move it, both the filters will match up as well. This saves a lot of setting up or missing sound, so you can basically work it exactly however you want to decide where in a frequency you want to cut and boost and saturate and play around. There's a QX2 button. This is basically a double resonance button, so you'd have normally a soft knee shape of a filter. When you turn it on, you'll just have a slightly sharper knee, so it's a bit more pronounced. There's a routing option to determine whether you high pass and low pass certain parts of the signal. You can high pass the saturation signal and low pass the dry, or low pass the saturation and high pass the dry. If you have this switch in whichever state and none of these on, this will have no effect. If though you choose to turn on the saturation signal filter, currently this will low pass the saturation, but it will leave the dry signal alone. It won't filter it. If you hit the switch the other way, you will high pass the saturation signal, and also it will leave the dry alone. So you've got quite good flexible controls there to give you some more sound design options. The saturation drive control gives you from 0 to 40 dB extra gain before it hits the saturation models. This can add more tone, more harmonics, and more distortion, so you can actually feed a much stronger signal before you get the signal coming out. It just adds more to it if you feel that you need to add more drive. There's 5 models and they're just labelled A to E. So again, we didn't want to get into the nitpicking of numbering and use this, use that, use this to give influence. You can play around and find the tone, because the sound going in, these models will reflect on maybe being the best one for one type of sound, but a different model for a different type of sound. And it all depends on the content. The dry level control is your parallel dry level knob. So you can basically, where it is at the moment, it's at unity. So what goes in comes out at the same level. When you turn it all the way down, you basically turn it to silence. You're turning off the dry level. So you can have just the saturation come through on its own. Onto the envelope section, you have a VCA mode, and this basically determines whether you envelope control the saturated signal or the saturated signal and the dry together gets controlled by the envelope. So you can basically create gated effects with it. There's an external detection LED, and this is for when you put in a sidechain signal. So again, it works like a compressor, but the sidechain can control when the envelope trips and does its thing. The threshold control is the setting for when the envelope should start to trigger. So you have a 0 dB down to -60. So if any signals go above -60, the envelope trips out straight away. Now what happens is that when the signal goes on to the envelope section, it will hit the threshold. It'll go move on to the attack stage. The attack stage takes a certain amount of time to go all the way to the top. As long as that signal is over that threshold within that attack time, it keeps turning up the attack. So you have an envelope shape here. This section in the first part is your attack. So you'll take like 100 milliseconds to get to the first section, as long as the threshold keeps being broken. So if you've gone 50 milliseconds in and the threshold has dropped, it won't attack anymore. It'll jump straight to the release stage, and it will look across and it will release at the level that it's at. It won't jump up to the maximum level. The attack, hold and release are the controls that set the timing of the envelope. You can have 0 milliseconds, so it's instantaneous. Your hold can be low, medium, slow, medium and fast, which creates a sort of sample and hold effect, and I'll demonstrate that shortly. And you've got a release control. The attack goes from 0 to 200 milliseconds, which is good for ducking out of the way of transients or allowing you to hit the transient nice and fast. The release goes from 0 to 2000 milliseconds or 2 seconds. When the release and the attack are at 0, this basically opens the saturation model completely. It would not use the envelope. It will only use the VCA depth to determine how much of the effect is going to be heard. Jumping back to the hold, where you got slow, medium, fast. You got fast 5 milliseconds, 0.1 of a second for medium, and half a second for slow. Now these can create quite, again, unpredictable movements in your sound because it's sample and holding, and it has to pass this stage, regardless of whether the threshold has been broken or not. In the hold stage, it has to complete the hold stage before it determines whether the threshold has been broken, to decide if it's going to stay as it is or whether it needs to rework and start to dip away back down to silence because of the release. The VCA depth, as a brief one on it a few seconds ago, this controls the percentage of how the signal's coming out. At the top you got 100%, so this is going to be basically saying that the envelope, once it's hit the top, that is unity gain level. That is going to be like whatever the input level is. If it was, say, coming in at -12, It will start at minus infinity, ramp up to get to minus 12 level, and then it will ramp down if the envelope needs to complete. If I did it halfway, then it's only half of that level, and it's in a percentage, but in decibels that works in a logarithmic fashion. So it will sound right to your ears, but in a math sense, it could get a bit deep and involved. Whether you say minus 12, okay, well, half of that technically would be like minus 24, but decibels are one of those sort of things. Now, as we're looking at the display, we can see that it's all quite interactive with our controls. There's two more controls that allow you to adjust the curve of the attack and the release. These are not MIDI editable, but they are editable in the display. And as you can see, the VCA level is also controlled, so you can fine tune with the knobs if you feel. The second view would be the envelope response view, and this will show you how and when the envelope is triggering and what it's actually doing. This first view just sets up the template envelope, or your ideal, how it would work if it's always going to pass through. The third view is a waveform view, which allows you to see left and right dry signal, as well as left and right saturated signal, all at the same time, and I'll show you how this works as well. The post EQ section has a similar control to the VCA section, where it decides whether it's going to EQ the saturated signal or the saturated or dry. So if you really wanted to, you didn't want to saturate at all, you can bring this all the way down. You can use this EQ purely as if we set them up to shelves, it can be a Pultec style EQ for low boost and high boost and boost and attenuation. You got 3 frequency options per band, so you got basically a low, mid, and then you've got a mid-high, high, I suppose, in between, and then a high. So you can choose your 3 different filters that way. Again, we didn't want to get hung up on numbers. This is all for characteristics, so you might find, okay, frequency B, it's fine for what I need to do for hi-hats or something. Your shelf and your high EQ can work together. Your shelf has plus minus 25. Your high EQ has plus minus 25. Your filter, when you switch to this mode, will change it to a frequency control, because you don't need the gain on the filters. And then you can bypass. So you can basically just use the high EQ parametric curve if you wanted to. So reset all this back. So it's back to default. And I'll add the tooltips on as well as we go. Okay, so that's a brief tour of Enforcer. There is more on the back, which is basically your CV controls, and these are all CV inputs, and they're all labelled up to let you know which control is for what. You got an envelope output CV, so that's helpful for if you're going to dynamically control something else, anywhere else in the Reason Rack. Okay, so without further ado, let's do a couple of demos. So the VCA depth is off, the threshold is all the way up. Just reset the device. So it says default, how you would find it. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight into what Enforcer could do. It's quite a flexible device because of the content that goes into it. Whatever content you put in will be different to what I may put into it, and I may shape it differently to how you may shape it. So there's a lot of flexibility in this device. That's Enforcer. That's some of the ideas that you could use it for. It can reshape your current sounds to give you something a little bit new, a little bit different than anybody else who's just going in and saturating something or EQing it or just filtering it. It's a mix of all three, and all three together can create some very interesting and very new sounding drum loops and musical phrases. Not just Rexes, this could be for anything. You could do it for a vocalist if you really want to. But yeah, feel free to go and try it. Drop us feedback on Reason Talk. Let us know what you think.